A macro is a special kind of hash define. In fact, the line, the preprocessor directive for a macro actually begins with hash define. Let me show you. A macro is a hash define that takes parameters. For example, hash define max a comma b in brackets. Notice the brackets. Before, when you had a hash define, all you had was the word, like max. Now you've got brackets and then some things inside the brackets. And then the definition is more complex. It actually makes reference to those things inside the brackets. You can think of a macro as a little mini function. Imagine a function that was called max, and you passed it to variables, x and y, say. Then you might think of the actual code. You could probably write the function yourself. It would be pretty straightforward. You would compare and see if a is greater than b, just like I'm doing here. Remember that question mark conditional operator? If a is greater than b is true, then a must be the maximum. Otherwise, b must be the maximum. So this kind of thing happens with macros as well. Let me show you the rest of this. This is how you might use this. You might have three variables, x, y, and z, and you might say z equals the maximum of x and y. Can you see that? Can you see? That would be a fairly straightforward thing to do. Just look at the last line of code. Just look at the last line of code and you'll see that that is a fairly simple line of code. If you had two variables, x and y, you could say that z is the maximum of those two. Obviously, we need to have x and y set to something, initialized, of course, so I'm just pretending that they have been initialized. Now, if at the top of that particular .c file you had the following hash define, or the hash define that you can see on the screen, what would happen would be that entire line of code after the equal sign but before the semicolon, in other words, max brackets x comma y comma, is substituted for, it will get substituted with a is greater than b, question mark a colon b. Except for the fact that in everywhere you won't actually have the a's and b's, you'll have x's and y's. It's kind of magic. Because a is the first parameter and b is the second parameter, we're using that macro definition with x and y. So x and y will be substituted into that particular formula that you've got. So it will read x is greater than y, question mark x colon y. Why don't we go and look at this exact example in source code and compile it and see what we get. Okay, here's macro.c in the chapter 9 folder. This is exactly the example that I showed you on the slide. Okay, there's our hash define. That's our macro, and there's the line of code. There's our three variables. This time I actually have initialized x and y, of course. Now, without trying to understand how macros work, what do you think the value of z will be? Well, if this is all going and working according to plan, the value of z will be 7, because 7 is the greater of 6 and 7, of course. So how does it work? Well, recall that all C preprocessor directives, including hash defines, are text substitution. So what will happen is a text substitution will occur every time you see the word max. It will be substituted with this max up here. And I'll show you how that works. Let me just, that will be our original line. I'll just make a duplicate of that, just so that we've got something to compare with. Now, this whole bit of code here, this whole sequence of code will be substituted with this whole sequence of code, because that's the way hash defines work. It's text substitution. So I will copy that, let's do a little copy there, and I will put it just here. So that's essentially what's going on. However, the C preprocessor is a little bit clever. It's saying, okay, x is the first parameter and y is the second parameter. So they get fed into a and b. So wherever you see an a, you should really think of that in this particular example as an x. And wherever you see a b, you should think of that as a y. So that is going to become x. That is going to become y. This is what the C preprocessor does, exactly this. It just does text substitution just like that. And that's all there is to it. So this is what we write as the programmer And this is the result of what happens after the C preprocessor gets to it. This is what actually gets sent to the compiler. Isn't that interesting? So in other words, that line would disappear. The C preprocessor would remove it for us, or in fact it would substitute it for us. But I'll put it back because I don't want it to go. I hope you're getting it. I'll give you another example. This one is a little bit, it's got some interesting things in it. I'll show them to you when we get there. I'm just going to create another macro now. Hash define double S. Doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter what they call the things inside the brackets here. S, I can call it anything I like. It does not have to be a variable that's declared. In fact, it's probably better that it's not. Just some little placeholder. S. I'm going to call this one for no particular reason. I just felt like calling it S. Obviously, it's double S is S times 2. Would you agree with that? Okay, so now I should be able to do this. Z equals double X. So Z is theoretically going to be 12. Let's prove that. We're going to get a substitution occur. I'll just make a copy of this line, and then we'll take this and copy it and come down here and paste it, except wherever we see S, it actually in this case gets replaced with X. So it'll be X times 2. You see that? That's the text substitution that the macro does. It's kind of magical. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. That's actually a simpler example than the previous one, but I want to show you now the following example. Instead of double X, I want to double X plus 1. Yeah? Okay, pretty straightforward. First of all, what's the answer going to be? Well, X plus 1 is obviously 7, so 2 times 7 is 14. Is that going to be what we get? Let's find out. I'll just do a printf. Okay, I've just inserted a little printf there. So that should work. Let's compile that. 0 errors. And run. Double X is 8. How do we get 8? I know what's going on, but do you? How could it be not working? Maybe everything I've said about macros is wrong. No, it's too simple to be wrong. S times 2, and we're putting in X plus 1. Okay, well let's see if we can figure it out by just doing what the preprocessor does. I'll just make a copy of this line. Again. Oops. Okay, now I'll go up here, and I'll take that, and I'll do the preprocessor substitution. I'll copy that, and I'll paste it here. Now, wherever I see S, in this case, I have to replace with that. That is the first parameter, X plus 1. Okay, so this becomes X plus 1. Okay, I'm actually going to comment out this line, hide it away from the compiler, and see if, now that's a really simple line of code. X plus 1 times 2. So that's 7 times 2. 6 plus 1 is 7 times 2. So surely that will have to be 14. Let's try it. No errors, and run. Oh, it's still 8. Interesting. Can you see what's going on? Can you see what it is? Can you remember back to the old rules of arithmetic precedence, that multiplications always happen before additions? So that is happening first. Can you see that? 1 times 2 is 2, and then after that, after the result of that multiplication, you add that to 6. So, in other words, it's going to be 6 plus 2, which is, of course, 8. So we don't want that to happen. We don't want that at all. So clearly, there's a little problem here when it comes to macros. We don't need that line of code anymore. This is not going to work if we feed it something like that. So what do we do about that? Is there a solution? Well, yes, there is in fact a solution. And this is a nice little guideline that I'm going to give you whenever you decide to write a macro. Use brackets. Use brackets everywhere. Use brackets where you can't even think you might ever need to use brackets. Just throw some brackets in, as many brackets as you can. In other words, put brackets, first of all, you've got to put brackets around that. So that if this ever gets substituted for, say, x plus 1, then the x plus 1 will happen first, and then the multiplied by 2 will happen last. Then, I'd go so far as to say put brackets around the whole lot, because you just never know. they might decide to use this in some other calculation. And you don't want to get anything confusing happening in the calculation. I would do the same here. Put brackets around everything. It's always the way with macros. It's a very simple macro, but I just want to make sure and put a bracket around the whole lot. Now I would say that that is a more working macro. It's more bulletproof. It's less likely to go wrong. Now just get it into your head. Whenever you need to write a macro, just throw brackets in there. As many brackets as seem plausible. Obviously, there's absolutely no point putting brackets around the 2. You can if you want to. It's certainly not going to hurt, but it's just pointless because 2 is 2 is 2. There's always 2. Whereas you just never know what's going to get substituted in there. And you also never know where this is going to get substituted. So just throw the brackets in just to make sure everything happens in the order that you want it to happen in. Okay, let's try and compile this now, and hopefully it will work properly. Double of x is 14. Okay, so that's much better. It's not 8 anymore. Okay, do you get the idea with macros? Good. If you don't, please just think about this a little bit more. This is simple text substitution. This x plus 1 gets put anytime you see an s here. This x gets put anytime you see an a here. A here and a here, and then y gets put wherever the b's were, because that is the first parameter and that is the second parameter. It would not make any sense. In fact, you would get a compiler error if you tried to do this. If you just tried to call the macro x with just one parameter. Max is defined as requiring 2 parameters separated by commas. So if you only give it 1, you're going to get a compiler error. And believe me, I will prove that to you. Total error is 1. What's the error? Macro max used with just one arg. Okay, that's saying you've only used it with one parameter. You really should have used it with 2. Okay, so I'll just undo that.